cafe versions and it has that. It's really not suburban. And they. Yeah.
Good. How's your registration going for your workshop?
Last I checked, there were 6 in. That was before I advertised to my classes, so.
Yeah. I advertised yesterday, so hopefully there's some.
Yeah.
Yeah, their minds on surviving their parents and then whatever they're doing.
Yeah, production.
I don't know.
Digital media stuff, a little bit less SOP stuff, website stuff, digital delivery and communication.
Hello, can you hear me?
Is that marketing?
Well, hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. I feel like you're all on this side, so I feel like you're shifting this volume over here. But, my name is Dan Bonso. I'm assistant professor of philosophy and director of the Center for Applied Ethics. In case you're not familiar with the Center for Applied Ethics, the center is an endowed ethics center founded in 2008, dedicated to enhancing ethical conversations across campus and the wider Menominee community. Some of our programming includes invited speakers, such as today. We've held discussion dinners with students. We have an applied ethics certificate, and then we hold the philosophers cafes, which are the second Wednesday of most months at Brewery Night at 7 p.m. Just a fun time to have conversations about controversial moral book issues. This event is also sponsored by the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovations, which is a nonpartisan, non-ideological academic center dedicated to the study and discussion of civil liberties through scholarly inquiry, educational activities, and community outreach. And I just will note that we are recording sessions since a number of people wanted to be here but couldn't, so just want to make you aware of that. So today I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. James Messina. Dr. Messina is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Purdue University. He offers courses in moral and political philosophy, the ethics of data science, and the history of practical philosophy. Before joining the faculty at Purdue, he held research positions at the University of New Orleans and Wellesley College. He received his PhD from UC San Diego in 2018. His first book, which you can pick up for free outside here, titled Private Censorship, was recently published with Oxford University Press. His talk for today is titled Workplace Censorship. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Messina.
Maybe in view of the podium being a little central, try to use this. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Zen, for the introduction, and to Afton and Zen for putting the event together, to both the Center for Applied Ethics and to the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions for your invitation. Thanks all of you for taking time out of your afternoon, setting day to be here and learn a little bit about my work. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It occurs to me that if I'm going to do this, I probably need this. So here to talk to you a bit today about some ideas from my book, Private Censorship. In the book's early chapters, you can see, or maybe see, the text is a little bit small. I talk about things like the concept of censorship, what it means for one agent to censor another agent, and also why we might care about censorship. I talk about the kind of intellectual atmosphere we might value if we value things like free speech and how censorship can threaten that value. I also talk about various respects in which, under certain conditions, idealized censorship can promote those kinds of values, and the sorts of considerations that might defeat censorship's ability to promote a healthy intellectual atmosphere. In the book's later chapters, I talk about various different institutions that have been implicated in censorship in recent years. So if you've followed the news, you've probably heard a lot about people getting fired or dismissed for things that they say. You might have heard about newspapers and broadcasting companies censoring TV shows and other content for not lining up with core values or marketing preferences. You surely heard about social media platforms banning or otherwise demoting certain kinds of speech. You may have heard about search engines burying certain prominent results. And so the book's later chapters are about each of those phenomena. The one that I want to talk to you today about is the topic of the third chapter, and is workplace censorship. Before we get there, what I want to do is talk about censorship in general terms. So if you're vaguely familiar with the idea, you might associate censorship in your head with the stoppage of speech. So you might think an agent A censors another agent B, just in case agent A stops B from speaking. Okay? That sort of simple definition is fairly close to the truth, but it won't do for a fairly obvious reason once you begin to think about it. That is that censorship doesn't seem to be a success term. So if ever there was censorship when the Soviet Union sanctioned its intelligentsia by threatening them with the gulags for dissenting speech. As the image on the slide shows, some people spoke and were sent to the gulags. It did not, in fact, stop them from speaking. Many more probably spoke and were undetected and unpunished. So that first definition is no good. Well, what if you add a second condition? You say, well, A censors B when A intentionally prevents B from expressing or accessing an idea or representation in a context, or imposes some cost upon B or threatens to impose some cost upon B to discourage her from doing so. For reasons I hope you'll agree, this definition doesn't fare all that much better. So I guess Scruggs is doing a reboot. But you can imagine that because the definition under consideration treats preventing someone from speaking as a sufficient condition of engaging in censorship, that the surgeon who uses general anesthesia is involved in censoring a patient. But that's preposterous. Of course, a surgeon that puts you under general anesthesia isn't engaged in censorship. Likewise, you might think that a professor who has the following rule in the classroom, namely, you must raise your hand before speaking or else your participation grade will be docked, does not engage in censorship. Right? This is one of the rules of order that keeps the conversation in the classroom going without undue interruption. Similarly, the run-of-the-mill newspaper editor that rejects Messina's editorial because it's lousy and doesn't meet the standards appropriate to the venue would, on this definition, be engaged in censorship. But again, I want to urge you to consider that that's not true. The point isn't that editors and teachers can't engage in censorship. The point is rather that they can stop speech and impose costs on speakers in ways that don't amount to censorship. And so the definition should be rejected. So suppose you have a professor of philosophy teaching a class on the ethics of abortion. And the professor says, anybody who espouses the pro-life position or the pro-choice position is going to fail this course. Clearly, the professor in that case is engaged in censorship. But the definition captures far more than that. And so I think we need to do better. The way that I think that we should do better is by looking at paradigm cases of censorship, the kinds of things that we all agree, yeah, censorship is happening there. Things like the threats in the USSR, things like the fact that in North Korea, you can only get information from the central news agency. Things like internet censorship in China that has resulted in search engines like Google pulling out as business partners. Things like the mid-20th century Nazi book burnings, where students on university campuses, urged on by Nazi politicians, took books from the libraries that threatened the regime and instructed them to burn them publicly to intimidate people who might be sympathetic with those ideas. Things like what happened in the United States in the early 20th century, before Oliver Wendell Holmes' Great Reversal. Probably everybody in this room has heard the phrase, free speech doesn't mean the freedom to shout fire in a crowded theater. Does anybody know where that phrase comes from? You would imagine, you'd be mistaken. So that comes from a court decision, the majority opinion of which was written by Holmes, pertaining to a case involving a guy called Charles Schenck. Schenck was the general secretary of the Communist Party in the United States. World War I was on. He authored and disseminated a pamphlet. The pamphlet encouraged citizens of the United States to obey the draft. On detection, it urged them to claim their 13th Amendment rights against enslavement as a defense. Kind of clever. I think. For that, Schenck was imprisoned under the Espionage Act, and the Holmes decision upheld his imprisonment on the grounds that, uttered as it was in wartime, his speech constituted shouting fire in a crowded theater or something like that. So these are paradigm cases of censorship. Cases where I think we all should agree that if you apply censorship here, you're using your words well. And I think if you look at what these cases have in common, it's not just that somebody is attempting to suppress some speech or imposing costs on agents for their speech, but it's that they're doing so for certain reasons. So in the book, what I say censorship is the attempted suppression of expressive content on the grounds that it's dangerous. Right? That's Schenck's problem. He did something dangerous in wartime in peril of the national security interests of the United States. Threatening to orthodoxy. That's what's going on when the CCP censors the internet in China. Or inimical to the material interests of the agent attempting to suppress it. Arguably, that's what's going on in the Nazi book burning case. Elites in power want to consolidate power by ensuring that threatening information isn't out there. And I mean each of those reasons to be read in a generous way, a broad way. So we can talk a little bit about what else I think these grounds include. But it's worth noting, for my purposes, that that's just what censorship is. And the topic of this book is censorship by non-state actors. That's what I mean by private censorship. Not a name of a military guy called private censorship, but it's just censorship by non-state actors. And then the topic today is workplace censorship, censorship of employees by employers. Great. So that's what we're talking about. Now, what is wrong with private censorship and censorship more generally? Just gonna get rid of this, I'm not using it anyway. Well, the answer is in the book, something like this. Sometimes censorship will violate a person's political right to free speech. That's what happens in cases of state censorship. Sometimes private censorship will amount to violating some other right, like the right against being defrauded, or the right against being misled in advertising contexts. But sometimes it's not going to infringe any pre-existing right, the political right to free speech or the right against being defrauded. But merely it's going to do something that I say compromises the kind of intellectual atmosphere we have reason to value free speech. So if there's something wrong with workplace censorship, what I want to say is that it's either going to infringe some right that we have reason to recognize, or if it doesn't, we're going to have reason to think that it's going to do something nasty with respect to our intellectual atmosphere. So now on to the main event. I want to start by bringing to your attention a pair of stories that you might have followed when they were happening. So the first story here, just to get details right, I'll stand at the podium, begins on May 28th, 2020, amidst widespread protests for racial justice following the brutal killing of George Floyd. That morning, some days after the killing, a young progressive data analyst named David Shore tweeted a short summary of a paper by Princeton professor Omar Wassau. The paper, published in the world's leading political science journal, reported results from a study of protests between 1960 and 1972. The study distinguished between nonviolent protests, especially those that were met with repression by the police, and those including activist-initiated violence. The study found that the latter kinds of activism increased the Republican vote share, whereas the former kinds increased support for Democratic politicians friendlier to activist aims. Here's what Shore tweeted. Post-MLK assassination race riots reduced Democratic vote share in surrounding counties by 2%, which was enough to tip the 1968 election to Nixon. Nonviolent protests increased Dem vote mainly by encouraging warm discourse and media coverage. It didn't take long for the nasty responses from peers, strangers, and coworkers alike to trickle in. Shore was called tone deaf, he was called a racist, and he was told that he should repent. And repent he did. A day after posting the tweet originally, he issued an apology. This didn't stop his firm, Citizen Analytics, from ultimately firing. Notice that Shore was speaking in a private capacity. He didn't invoke the name of his firm. He didn't talk about his position at the firm. He just tweeted the results of the study. His gloss on that study, again published in a leading journal by a respected political scientist, was about as accurate as you could expect it to be given the chosen medium of expression and its famous character limit. There's little cause for thinking that there was any kind of professional misconduct here, and together these points suggest that Shore was fired by his employer for his unobjectionable private speech. Take a second case. This one involving a tweet by policy analyst Will Wilkinson. In the wake of the 2021 Capitol riot, Wilkinson tweeted the following. If Biden really wanted unity, he'd lynch Mike Pence. Colorful language, true, but meant in jest and critical of the kind of disunity the Republican Party was courting by tolerating and embracing Trump. Nevertheless, Wilkinson's employer, the Scannon Center, caved to right-wing political pressure and relieved Wilkinson of his position. One of the most striking features of both of the firings is how clearly they violate proportionality, constraint on sanctions. What Shore did, namely tweet an academic study, was not wrong, and though it might have been ill-timed and insensitive due to its timing, the appropriate sanction in this case is nothing. By contrast, the actual sanction, termination, significantly set back Shore's interests, at least in the short term. Wilkinson's remark, by contrast, was insensitive. But did he deserve to lose his job? And what are the prospects for political satire if people regularly face termination for the things that they say on their own time? If you notice, the tweet was sent at 10:32 p.m. In her provocative book, Private Government, philosopher Elizabeth Anderson raises the alarm bells about this sort of thing. For Anderson, granting companies rights to sanction their employees for the things that they say grants them certain government-like powers. Minimally, if we're motivated to ensure that our speech environment is healthy, it's reasonable to worry that employers can dominate their employees exactly where it matters most, namely when they express unpopular opinions about matters of public importance. In turn, this can exert a chilling effect on speech, leading people to hold back their controversial opinions in public. If the real ability to speak free of censure is crucial to our environment for discourse, these employer powers look like bad news for speech and therefore for democracy. The concern is not abstract. Mid-20th century America witnessed massive coordination between employers across the entertainment industry to refuse employment to anyone suspected of communism. Doubtless, they were urged on in this by the government and its House Un-American Activities Committee. But many of the worst offenses were perpetrated by trade unions, advertisers, and network producers. Those working in the industry could have their characters, reputations, and livelihoods destroyed by so much as appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The result was a chilling atmosphere for discourse in which those even suspected of communism had to engage in regular rituals of self-flagellation to prove their loyalty to American values. More recently, after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, many Harvard University student groups and their members signed a letter placing the sole responsibility for the attacks on Israel. In turn, employers like Bill Ackman, who's shown on the screen here, at Pershing Square Capital Management, demanded the release of Harvard signatories so that they could be sure not to hire them. Days later, a truck with a billboard drove through Cambridge, Massachusetts, displaying the names and faces of those associated, further raising the stakes. More recently still, a number of employees were fired or otherwise sanctioned for their social media activity in the wake of Charlie Kirk's killing at Utah Valley University last year. Worries about the ways in which employers can contribute to a stifling atmosphere surrounding certain contested issues are bolstered by some empirical evidence that the workplace is increasingly politicized in our age. Researchers find that workplaces are more homogenized than ever. This appears to be in part because hiring is already a partisan affair. Employers are looking not just at their employees' qualifications, but also at their values and political orientations as evidenced by things like their social media presence. Some of this we might expect is for reasons downstream of employer preference. Social media makes it easier than ever to cause a great deal of hardship for a business by simply noting that it employs one unsavory type for another. When faced with these kinds of external pressures, businesses have an incentive to ensure that their hires are safe, meaning that they are unlikely to tarnish the firm's reputation. But whether grounded in employer preference or in external pressure, the consequences for our intellectual environment are grave, and it can seem that something needs to be done about it. Many, like Anderson, support legal protections for employees against workplace censorship, which amount at the same time to legal prohibitions of workplace censorship. In the rest of this talk, what I want to do is argue that broad legal prohibitions on workplace censorship, though motivated for good reasons, would be a mistake. But first, worth saying something about what I have in mind when I talk about these kinds of protections and prohibitions. So on the screen now, you can see one case. This is from Connecticut state law, which states any employer, including the state in any instrumentality or political subdivision thereof, who subjects any employee to discipline or discharge on account of the exercise by such employee of rights guaranteed by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, provided such activity does not substantially or materially interfere with the employee's bona fide job performance, shall be liable to such employee for damages caused by such discipline or discharge, including punitive damages and for reasonable attorney's fees. In plain English, the statute limits employers' rights to censor employees' protected speech to conditions under which that speech negatively impacts the employee's ability to perform on the job. This is what I mean by broad legal protections against workplace censorship, the sort of legal measure that attempts to prohibit by legislative means the sanctioning of employees for their speech, especially their protected First Amendment speech. In theory, this sounds great. Surely the way to merit punishment at work is to do your job poorly. In ensuring that employers cannot punish you for exercising your First Amendment rights, the Connecticut statute unequivocally stands up for individuals against private powers. Although they sound great in the abstract, I'd argue in what follows that there are a number of reasons to resist them. The first set of reasons pertains to an important liberal right, namely the right to freedom of association. Freedom of association says that consenting adults are entitled to enter, leave, and define relationships with consenting others as they see fit. Consider Nozick's example of a woman who attracts 4 marriage proposals. Naturally, her decision about who to marry, which of the 4, if any of the 4, deeply affects each of the lives of her 4 suitors. And yet none of the 4 has anything that looks like a right so much as a say in her decision, right? Along similar lines, Nozick retells the story of conductor Arturo Toscanini's retirement. Toscanini conducted an orchestra called the Symphony of the Air, a charming name. Due to Toscanini's stewardship, the symphony was able to gainfully employ many musicians. Eventually, he wanted to hang it up, dissolve. His decision, we are to imagine, effectively forces its members, the orchestra, the symphony's members, to find another job, with no guarantee that they'll find a job in the performing arts. However much we imagine this negatively affects their lives, it seems ludicrous to suggest that Toscanini's decision is in the hands of the symphony members. Nozick expects you to share these judgments in these cases because he expects that you too are committed to upholding the liberal right to freedom of association. He expects you to affirm them even if the woman chooses to marry the worst of the suitors for the most vicious and superficial reasons, and even if Toscanini could carry on conducting without any significant strain. It seems to me that Nozick is correct on these points. Although there is disagreement about the scope of the right to free association, along with its justification, it's sufficiently robust to allow people to decide to enter into marriages and to end cooperative ventures as they see fit, even when their choices are deeply and negatively impacting others' lives. The first step of the argument would be to show that the same right that gives the woman the final say in her choice among suitors, and Toscanini the final say in when and whether to dissolve the Symphony of the Air, applies to more standard business ventures. To see this, consider a stylized story. Janet begins her career as a bartender. She works diligently and spends sparingly so that one day she'll be able to open up her own bar, a dream that she's had since her father died and his own bar had to be sold to cover some outstanding debts. As her goal comes clearly into view, she secures the relevant permitting, begins to talk to potential employees, puts down security deposits on the lease for the space, and begins to purchase inventory. She then hires people that seem to share her vision and people who she predicts will perform well in their roles. She opens up, and after some time, she learns that one of her hires, call him Nick, has been attending some unsavory political rallies aimed at furthering white dominance. Upon learning this, Janet makes an attempt at understanding. She and Nick sit down to talk. Janet realizes that the two of them are terribly far apart. They're unlikely to see eye to eye. She finds it difficult to bear the thought of working alongside someone who has views anathema to her own, and she tells Nick to seek employment elsewhere. There's no question that Nick has a right to attend these rallies protected by the First Amendment. The question is whether those that Nick associates with ought to be legally obliged to continue to associate with him and to use their hard-won resources in rare moments in this life, provide him with opportunities when others might stand in equally well. The answer is clearly no for his friends. Friends with Nick don't like his politics, tell him to find other friends. Similarly, his romantic partners, his family. Also, any social groups he might belong to, including his church. Should Janet's business enterprise really be treated differently just because of the kind of thing that it is? That's what the Connecticut statute suggests. The idea that businesses should be denied rights to associated freedom faces strong headwinds when we realize that it would be perfectly above board for Janet to decide to close the business entirely. She could do this without having to pay her employees severance. The end of her enterprise would be bad news for the people who rely on it, her customers, state tax collectors, the other people that she employs. But her right to close up shop is surely no less strong than Toscanini's right to dissolve its orchestra. And it's hard to see why she can close up shop, depriving all of her employees of livelihood for any reason that she might want. She cannot fire one of them because she dislikes his speech or patterns of association. This is too quick. I'll tell you why. I wish it weren't, because then we'd be done. We accept that business owners can close their doors for any reason they want, but deny that they can condition continued employment on sexual favors. So I can close my shop, but I can't demand that my employees engage in sexual favors to their jobs. I can close up shop, but I can't legally fire people on the grounds of race, sex, or other protected categories. Even if employers do enjoy the freedom of association, it seems to have important limits. Why not think that those limits also bar employers dissociating from employees on grounds of their political speech? The thing to notice, I think, is how significant a burden the state would impose upon someone like Janet if it were to force her to continue to associate with someone like Nick. Not only must she continue to advance the interests of someone she has very good reasons to loathe, she also has to spend precious hours of her life alongside him, allowing him to share her success and being vulnerable to him in moments of failure. Importantly, denying Janet associative freedom significantly curtails her own ability to live in accordance with the ideals that she holds deeply. While the state might have an interest in securing people in their ability to hold unpopular views, making this duty fall so squarely on business owners like Janet can make it difficult for them to live well. By contrast, at least in objective terms, it's not very burdensome to be prevented by law from engaging in sexual coercion. Reflecting on Janet's story yields the argument from the freedom of association, which goes like this. The argument from freedom of association. Business owners have the right to freedom of association. The freedom of association analytically entails the freedom to dissociate and change the terms of the association within certain limits. Workplace censorship just amounts to exercising these rights on grounds of employee speech. Therefore, business owners have the right to engage in workplace censorship. You might point out that if we're to believe the first premise, and indeed the third premise on the basis of Janet's story, this is again too quick. Janet's is, after all, a small business. If she is prevented from firing Nick, when she finds his views and values objectionable, she's effectively forced to spend her time alongside coworkers she has good reason to want to avoid. Her ability to express her own views through her patterns of association is through the law compromised. But things are otherwise, one might think, with respect to larger firms, Target, Walmart, Amazon, Google, Deloitte, and the other major players in the US economy. In these cases, companies are owned by shareholders who have no day-to-day contact with their employees. The sense in which they have views, these companies of their own, the owners of these companies, is tenuous at best. This makes plausible the idea that employers' rights to association will vary in stringency with the kind of firm that they own. And I think that's right. We might draw on some distinctions, and I will draw on some distinctions from the Supreme Court for assessing the stringency of firms' right to free association. In its ruling on the freedom of association, the rulings on the freedom of association, the Supreme Court explicitly distinguishes between intimate and non-intimate firms. Intimate firms are firms that are highly selective in terms of their membership, firms that are relatively small in size, firms that have relatively low turnover of membership, firms that limit participation in their central activities to members, and have a general practice of excluding strangers from their activities. Sorry, this is associations. The court does not extend this reasoning to firms. My argument is that maybe it should.
Notice that commercial enterprises of varying kinds, while they vary in size, often clearly meet these criteria. Job searches are often highly selective. Employees and employers interact, in at least cases like Janet's, with a high degree of regularity. Given the cost of turnover, employers have reason to keep it low, and tasks regarding the firm's mission can be done only by persons that the firm hires and authorizes to perform them. While a business is almost always going to be a good deal less intimate than a family or a friendship, so too will social clubs and other kinds of entities that clearly have moral rights to freedom of association. Whereas the court has tended to acknowledge that participants in intimate associations have fairly robust rights to dissociate, it has tended to deny or remain silent it's tended to deny that those that fail to meet these conditions enjoy such freedoms. Perhaps you think the court is right. If so, employers that are relatively like intimate associations enjoy freedom to associate, not as a legal matter, but it seems to be a plausible moral argument. Janet can dissociate from Nick. As for other employers, they're out of luck. But there is another distinction that is relevant for determining the strength of a firm's right to freedom of association. This is the distinction between expressive and non-expressive associations. A firm has an expressive purpose just in case among its reasons for existence is organizing around or supporting a point of view. As with intimate associations, the court affords expressive associations greater leeway in determining who it associates with. This is because associating with those whose views are publicly contrary to the organization's expressive purpose can compromise its ability to express what it's organized to express. Examples of expressive associations include think tanks, policy firms, advocacy groups, and institutions generally founded with a strong sense of vision that can be compromised by discordant employee speech. Many of them will be explicitly ideological in nature and will have strong regulations determining how members can speak, especially publicly. Such firms must, in order to function well, be permitted broad authority over their membership speech, and I think that there are good reasons to have organizations like that. Such expressive organizations can play an extremely valuable role in civil society. They can serve as enclaves for cultivating and articulating certain points of view. Such enclaves can be useful for developing views among the like-minded before subjecting them to outside scrutiny, ultimately serving as a kind of incubator for them. A small-scale example of this is academic departments. If economics departments had to deal with philosophers' objections before they published their research, they would never get anything done. Same probably holds in reverse. So when dealing with firms that serve this kind of purpose, I think it's sensible to grant them stronger associative rights to determine the kinds of people that they wish to work with, which generates a very attractive image. On the far end of the spectrum are firms we might think that are both intimate and expressive. These firms have the most stringent associative interests and so the most stringent associative rights. Squarely in the middle of the spectrum are those firms that are either intimate or expressive, but not both. Such firms have moderately strong associational rights. And then there are firms that serve neither expressive interests nor are they intimate, which we might think grant them weak associative rights. One might say then that firms that meet either or both of these conditions ought to enjoy freedom from legal sanction for hiring and firing persons for their on or off the job speech. But when it comes to those many, many firms that are neither intimate nor expressive, the case against state regulation of their associative liberty is far weaker. By the way, at this point, I take myself to have already argued against broad statutory protections for employee speech like the one in Connecticut, because it doesn't make these kinds of distinctions. What I want to do now is suggest that even pertaining to the firms that find themselves in the bottom right quadrant of this matrix might enjoys some legal discretion to fire employees for their speech. That's not going to ground out in their associative rights, which I've already granted are weak. Rather, it will ground out in various different pragmatic considerations pertaining to empowering firms with discretion to dissociate from their employers. Consider the fact that an employer's desire to discriminate in the hiring phase will vary with the costs that it faces in terminating the employment relation. If I know that I'm liable to a lawsuit, potentially costly lawsuit, for firing you for the things that you say, which I perceive will hurt my business in some capacity or other, I'll expend more resources attempting to avoid hiring risky personnel in the first place. This kind of risk aversion amplifies rather than mollifies concerns that the dependence on private employment chills speech throughout civil society. Paradoxically, if recent data that firms are already investing more in ensuring that their hires are safe strikes you as bad news for our free speech environment, you should probably be reluctant to further restrict employers' discretion to cut ties with employees on grounds of their speech. Although one could in theory address this risk by barring employers from taking political speech into account when making the decision to hire a candidate, those of us who have served on academic search committees will know that it's difficult to enforce such requirements. Given even just a few qualified applicants, employers will be able to find reasons to rule a risky candidate out that do not touch in any way on their political activity. Even setting this problem aside, it's just not easy to legislate away employer discretion. Indeed, even in jurisdictions with formal legal protections for employee speech, employers often retain considerable powers to dismiss them for their speech. And I'm going to show this by telling a few stories about a couple of different jurisdictions that do protect employee speech, namely the just cause dismissal regime in the United Kingdom and the case law concerning public employee dismissal in the United States. In the UK, employees enjoy considerable de jure protection against unjust dismissal. These protections extend, at least in principle, to dismissals granted employees off the job speech as well as their on the job speech. Though these cases are adjudicated more frequently than they are in the United States, the courts rarely side with employees. Indeed, the UK's Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitration Service reports a considerable increase in employers who discipline employees for their speech on social media. Scholars have noted in turn that the disciplinary actions are often upheld in arbitration. But social media is not the lone culprit. For example, in Northwest London Hospitals, NHS Trust versus Bowater, the Employment Appeal Tribunal found in favor of a hospital's dismissing a nurse for inappropriately remarking that it had been a long time since she had had a man beneath her. A joke. Nor are the firings concerned exclusively with on-the-job speech. Perhaps you think that that's uncouth, that nurses shouldn't be behaving that way with respect to their patients. The same tribunal has also upheld firings for employees off the job political speech or politically adjacent speech. For instance, in Rustamova versus the governing body of Calder High School, a teacher was dismissed for publishing a book online, which was described as racist, featured characters said to be recognizable as current staff and students. Discussing the broader legal environment for speech in the United Kingdom, one scholar notes that employee speech enjoys robust protection only when such speech is uncontroversially responsible. This, he notes, offers surprisingly little protection for employees who are targeted for their speech. For further evidence, consider the way that US courts handle the speech of public employees. Notice in this case that the employer is the state, and the state doesn't get to play censor just because it's in the business of employing people. Instead, state employees have widely recognized First Amendment rights on and off the job. The state, at least that's the theory, sorry. But in practice, the state reserves for itself considerable rights to censor employee speech. in often alarming ways. Law professor Helen Norton points out that this owes in effect to two facts. First, courts have upheld firings in cases where employees' off-the-job speech is asserted to undermine the state's ability to express its contrary views. Thus, for example, a police officer was fired when the department discovered that he maintained a pornographic website featuring he and his wife. The courts upheld the dismissal insofar as the website was incompatible with the police department's ability to express its own anti-pornography views. Second, and more troublingly, the court held in Garcetti versus Ceballos that state employers could regulate any employee's speech uttered pursuant to his or her official duties. The effect has been to prevent employee whistleblowing on matters of public concern. More concretely, courts have found no First Amendment issue with agencies that fire employees for, among other things, their reports of safety hazards, ethical improprieties, and other misconduct. Examples include criticizing police work, reporting officials' financial or ethical improprieties, and criticizing administration priorities. The state, in short, has been allowed to censor employee speech where it matters most, merely by assigning to employees duties and holding agencies accountable. Individual states that adopt explicit statutes like Connecticut often fare no better in protecting employee speech on the ground. The lesson is that formal legal protections for employee speech seldom suffice to achieve effective protection for the same. In many cultural legal contexts, employers sufficiently interested in sanctioning employees for their speech will often be allowed to do so, even where laws recognize employees' rights to speak. I don't mean to suggest anything so crude as the impossibility of upholding worker speech rights through the law. I mean only to insist that merely determining that a firm, for example, one that is not expressive and not intimate, does not have a robust interest in freedom of association is not enough to show that legislation is a promising path for protecting workers. Worker speech is unlikely to receive effective protection unless the broader socio-political culture is committed to protecting it. It's important, in my view, to keep in mind what Alexis de Tocqueville saw clearly, namely that the most fortunate situation in the best laws cannot maintain a constitution in spite of mores, while the latter, namely bad mores, still turn to good account the most unfavorable position in the worst laws. If Tocqueville is right and legal change by itself can't solve our problems, then we shouldn't underestimate the importance of cultural education and a rediscovery of the values of an open atmosphere for free discourse. This is so, I suggest, whether we choose to pursue legal change or not. In other words, even if you're unpersuaded and we should go the Connecticut route or some restricted version of the Connecticut route, carving out exceptions for expressive and intimate firms, there's going to remain a lot of employee sanctioned speech because there's going to remain a lot of employer discretion. It's urgent in such a case to examine what normative resources there might be for encouraging firms to exercise their discretion well, and in ways that do not create a stifling intellectual atmosphere for people who have to seek employment at them. I want to turn now to these issues. I'll argue that employers should often avoid sanctioning employee speech, even when they're empowered to do so by law, and even when their legal empowerment reflects their rights to free association. When they censor speech wrongly, stakeholders should hold them accountable. Why? First, employers often have compelling reason to embrace ideological diversity within their workforce, grounded in their narrow pursuit of self-interest. Since refraining from censorship is often a necessary, though insufficient, means of accommodating diversity of the relevant kind, employers will often have narrow, self-interested reasons to tolerate undesired employee speech. If this is correct, and employers can be helped to see the respects in which protecting worker speech is good for them, then we can begin to address the issue. Second, however, even when toleration is not within employers' narrow self-interest, they sometimes ought to extend such toleration regardless. This is because, as impactful institutions, employers play a substantial role in realizing or compromising an environment and ethos in which this kind of diversity can flourish. When firms fail in this, the public has resources, including boycotts and social pressure campaigns, to hold them accountable. So why do I think that respecting employee speech is often good for firms? My case will rely on a normative claim that I won't defend and two empirical claims which I'll defend quickly. The normative claim is that, among other things, firms have reason to do things that increase their effectiveness and profitability. Seems pretty uncontroversial. You don't have to be Milton Friedman to agree that firms have reasons that are grounded in their narrow organizational interests. So I won't defend that. I'll assume you're reasonable and agree. The empirical claims are a little bit more controversial. The first says that workplace diversity of the right kind often helps firms increase their effectiveness and profitability. The second empirical claim is that workplace censorship often threatens workplace diversity of the relevant kind. So, why believe those two things? First, claim one, diversity is often good for the firm. Consider an experiment conducted by Catherine Phillips, a psychologist, and her colleagues. The experiment tasks groups of individuals with solving a murder mystery. Sounds exciting. I wish my work had conducting murder mystery experiments. Some groups consisted of only familiar persons, whereas others incorporated strangers. The teams without group members reported less certainty about their effectiveness and enjoyed the task less, but did far better than the less diverse groups. Whereas the less diverse groups selected the guilty party roughly half the time, the more diverse groups had a 75% success rate, a 50% improvement. Why? One hypothesis is that the very things that make diversity and working on diverse teams difficult and unpleasant also make it effective. Thus, the fact that we are more skeptical of outsiders, that we criticize them more, that we're forced to defend themselves against their criticisms, helps to explain why diverse groups do better than homogenous groups. Having diverse perspectives in complex decision-making is useful because people with different approaches to problem solving can correct one another's blind spots and encourage the group to be more self-critical, digging deeper into the merits and demerits of various proposals. Groups comprised of individuals who apply different mental models to problems consider a wider range of reasons for and against certain solutions, and in doing so are more likely to find the right ones. It's important. By contrast, when we're in homogenous groups, we tend to approach the problems we face in similar ways. In coordinating on a solution, there's less likely to be friction. We're less likely to have to disagree and to convince holdouts, and we're less likely to be confronted with powerful reasons that suggest that our own approach might be misguided. Thus, we should predict both that employees and employers alike should exhibit preferences for homogeneity that will cut against the true interests of their firms. To be clear, it isn't simply that more diverse teams of employees might outperform more homogenous teams holding fixed and equal the ability level of each team. Rather, as Scott Page has shown, people with diverse cognitive repertoires, those who use different mental models, have different background experiences, information, knowledge, and frameworks for understanding, often outperform groups with less diversity in these areas, even if the members of the less diverse group are generally of higher skill competence. This is because less diverse groups of high ability individuals can often duplicate one another's tool sets and approaches to problems, while more diverse groups will benefit from additional approaches and tools. It is also because social pressure within homogenous groups tends to be higher, and social pressure can induce coordination on demonstrably poor solutions. If you're familiar with this experiment by Solomon Ash, you know that a group of people was shown lines of very clearly different lengths. If there was social pressure to say that they were of the same length, even when they were nakedly not the same length, people would tend to converge on that falsity. And this is a robust result in social psychology. So that's enough about claim one. What about claim two? Workplace censorship often threatens workplace diversity. If this research is on the right track, employers will often have reason to insist on diversity, even when they would prefer more like-minded teams. This will mean refraining from dismissing employees when they begin to exhibit outward signs that they might hold certain minority positions on certain questions. It offers employers reason to resist calls on social media for firing employees when they do so. And it provides at least some reason for employers to develop ways of promoting harmony in the face of diversity, rather than pursuing the easier path to harmony and homogeneity. For these reasons, one might question the organizational rationality of firms that attempt to promote an ideologically unified workplace. Google, for instance, has been accused by a number of employees of suppressing conservative views, along with some allegations going so far as to accuse the company of dismissing employees for their dissenting views. There's a question of fact here, and Google denies the allegations, but without weighing in on that question, we can safely say that if the allegations are true, Google is plausibly acting contrary to its own organizational interests. In short, firms looking to maximize organizational efficacy or even simply improve it should be motivated to come up with ways to take advantage of the diverse cognitive repertoires of their employees. They should resist the urge to pursue unity in their team composition, even when team members themselves seem more satisfied in homogeneous units. It's easy to overstate the strength of these claims. It's easy to exaggerate and suggest there are no limits to diversity's organizational benefits, and claim that it is irrational from the narrow perspective of firms' instrumental rationality for them to accommodate diversity at all costs. It would be disingenuous to suggest that there aren't cases of workplace speech that threaten a firm's ability to maintain meaningful kinds of diversity. Some employees, after all, are like Ignatius Riley, a purely imaginary Lucky's Hot Dogs employee who takes to social media to post a tirade advocating for ethnic cleansing. Lucky's will naturally find it difficult to retain both Riley and its non-white workforce. Lucky's interest in diversity may itself favor letting Ignatius go rather than keeping him on. The lesson: there are different sources of diversity, and these will have to be balanced against one another in cases of conflict. Beyond cases like Ignatius Riley's case, there are bound to be other conditions under which firms will not benefit from accommodating diversity and refraining from censorship. This will be true, for example, when tasks are simple rather than complex. Diversity bonuses don't really apply when it comes to simple tasks. When relevant diversity does not predict diversity in cognitive repertoires, so you can imagine disagreement rabid on certain issues, just not predicting anything about the different tools that employees bring to the problem-solving enterprise. When the relevant diversity undermines the team ability to function, so here it's not just that people don't like to work with one another and find it unpleasant, but you have a completely dysfunctional team. And in general, any time where the costs of accommodating diversity outweigh the benefits from diversity bonuses, which might be there. Okay. What I want to suggest now, granting these caveats, is that when firms are under organizational pressure to fire employees because some of these conditions are met, there are moral reasons for them to resist those pressures. Consider the circumstances surrounding the 2021 forced resignation of Teen Vogue editor Alexi McCammon. You might remember this case. McCammon, recently named Emerging Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists, was poised to be the magazine's third Black editor. Her employment situation became precarious when screenshots of some of her 2011 tweets surfaced. In the tweets, McCammon expressed negative comments about Asian features, derogatory stereotypes about Asians, and slurs for gay people. This was not the first time such tweets surfaced. In 2019, too, they had been discovered. And at the time, McCammon apologized for them and deleted them. After her 2021 hire at Teen Vogue was announced, more than 20 staff members at the outlet signed a social media letter objecting to her appointment. McCammon replied, "I've apologized for my past racist and homophobic tweets and will reiterate that there's no excuse for perpetuating those awful stereotypes in any way." As Ulta Beauty and Burt's Bees pulled their advertisements from the magazine, pressure mounted. Days later, a meeting with other important staffers was canceled, not to be rescheduled. Seeing the writing on the wall, McCammon resigned. I want to suggest that in cases with features like these, when persons make mistakes or speak wrongly or irresponsibly and other persons call for them to be punished in ways that undermine the firm's ability to achieve its purposes easily, firms should often refuse to side with those who are angry. They should do so even when operations would be smoother without the relevant employee, and even if the firm might have had to expend valuable resources to ensure a productive work environment moving forward. Here are some reasons why. First, by capitulating to the demands of those employees that would refuse to work with such a person, companies contribute to creating a situation in which mobs get what they want. But as John Stuart Mill reminds us, when mobs can too easily enforce their conception of what counts as acceptable speech, the result can be worse in certain respects than state censorship. He dramatically claims that it can enslave the soul itself. To the degree that it becomes easy to pressure powerful institutions to part ways with people who say things that press unpopular and in some cases unacceptable views, the atmosphere can become one in which no one feels very comfortable to press the envelope and question social orthodoxy. Isn't it hard to see why such a state of affairs is suboptimal? By standing with targeted employees in these kinds of cases, companies can avoid creating such a silencing climate. A second reason that firms should stand with their employees in spite of the cost of doing so is that we all have an interest in ensuring that we don't cultivate norms according to which productive relationships can be terminated for years-old mistakes. The social world is perilous enough without it being the case that human enough missteps that we make as 17-year-olds can haunt us where we get our bread. By siding with employees in cases like this, companies do their part in helping to reinforce norms that suggest that things like this, while they might have repercussions, don't have life-altering repercussions. None of this means that firms should remain quiet or refrain from criticizing their employees' speech. Much less does it mean that the rest of us have to learn about this kind of speech. But in working to hold one another accountable, we have to remember that social pressure is a powerful tool, one that must be wielded carefully and that once unleashed is very difficult to restrain, contain. These moral reasons to stand behind employees, of course, have limits. It's not plausible to suggest that every ideological or speech-based firing is to be repudiated on ethical grounds. I've said a lot here, but if I were to end here, I suspect I'd leave you a little unsatisfied, at least with respect to the early cases we began with. So what should we think of the cases involving David Shore and Will Wilkinson? Shore was employed by a firm called Civis Analytics. It's a small data analysis firm. Wilkinson was employed by the Niskanen Center, a think tank. Both of these firms have, on my view, strong associational rights because they're both expressive and intimate. They're in the top left quadrant, the strongest quadrant. This implies that the law would overreach if it were to subject them to liability for their firings. For all that, the firings were short-sighted and harmful for the kind of speech environment we have reason to want. It makes a mockery of accountability for people to lose their jobs for tweeting academic studies by leading scholars. It makes a mockery of accountability when people lose their jobs for jokes, even when they're in bad taste. Accordingly, both Civis Analytics and the Niskanen Center should be harshly criticized for their behavior. They've abused the discretion that we have good reason to afford to them given the kinds of enterprises that they are. And they've done so not only to the detriment of Shore and Wilkinson, but to the detriment of us all. For in caving to social pressure campaigns and in making casual speech the grounds for dismissal, they've helped sustain an environment in which many more will refrain from expressing themselves to avoid meeting similar fates. It's no mistake, I think, that both the Niskanen Center and Civis Analytics cited pressure from readers and clients to distance themselves from these employees. While I've argued that firms have duties to refrain from firing their employees under a range of circumstances, it's important for each of us to understand that our own behavior can make it easier or more costly for them to comply with reasons and these duties. Given what we know about human motivation, we should ourselves be cautious about our role in making heavier the air that we collectively breathe. Because so many speech-related firings do come from pressure campaigns, either from within companies or outside of them, firms that want to do their part and refrain from further degrading our intellectual atmosphere might consider crafting speech policies in which they pre-commit to resisting certain kinds of pressures. Such commitment devices can be cited to diffuse campaigns to fire employees, sometimes helping firms to avoid making suboptimal decisions, and sometimes helping them to absorb the costs better of doing the right thing. If unilateral action would prove detrimental in the face of collective action problems, firms can band together and commit to protecting employee speech through professional organizations. Civil society groups can punish firms that fail to so commit. Although keeping such commitments might occasionally cost firms in terms of their bottom lines, it also frees them from incurring unnecessary turnover costs. By using civil society resources to address the threats of workplace censorship, our civilizations ensure that they respect the freedom of association so important for governing civil society at the same time. They can also ensure that the solution is more stable due to the greater affirmative buy-in than is often the case when it comes to broad legal protections of the sort that Connecticut and the United Kingdom seek to enact. So let me sum up here. I've defended a strong presumption in some favor of some for-profit firms' rights to freedom of association, extending so far as to grant legal rights to firms like Civis Analytics and the Niskanen Center to terminate employees for bad reasons related to their speech. I then noted that whether we recognize such rights or not, firms will retain powers to censor in ways that are reasonably thought of at odds with million concerns about social tyranny. In addition to offering reasons for thinking that eliminating this kind of discretion is undesirable and might be legally difficult, I've offered reasons for thinking that firms generally ought to exercise their discretion in ways that keep workplace censorship rare. But to say that it should be kept rare is not to say that it has no place. In the case of expressive associations and associations' efforts to accommodate diversity of certain kinds, firing employees for what they say is sometimes the best option. In order to realize a better intellectual atmosphere, I've suggested that we need badly to rediscover the importance of such an atmosphere and to wield our own social power wisely. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you for your attention.
All right, we have some time for questions, if anybody has any.
I have a quick question about the lynching. So just with the language, I don't know a lot about like what our rights are in regards to hate speech, but is using the word lynch, just with the history that we have in this country, even though we have like Biden is white and Pence is white, but that word lynch itself, is that hate speech?
So it may or may not be hate speech. That's going to depend on like really thorny issues involved with trying to define hate speech as a concept. In certain jurisdictions, it might count. The United States, however, doesn't carve out a hate speech exception to free speech, and so it counts as protected speech, whether it is hate speech or not. So that's going to go for all sorts of even nastier things that you could say, even if you mess with the races of the parties in the example. Of course, doing those things changes the content of what's being said and might give employers better reasons than they have in this particular case for firing someone. But the general point is that if you go the Connecticut route and extend broad protections for constitutionally protected speech to employees, employers couldn't fire employees who had like tweeted that all Blacks should be lynched. That's just the reality of the hate speech context in the United States. They'd be in trouble unless the employer could show that the employee was sufficiently hampered in their ability to perform their job duties.
Great. Other questions?
Thanks. I have a question about the matrix and the non-expressive, non-intimate category. Am I remembering correctly, you wouldn't support legal protections for workers even in that category?
So I have worries about statutes that are even narrower than Connecticut's and apply only to non-expressive, non-intimate firms that I tried to speak a little bit about. What I agree with is that there's no in principle freedom of association based reason to oppose those laws. So the reasons to oppose the laws in the bottom right quadrant all pertain to the difficulty on instrumental grounds of making those laws effective remedies for employees who speak and get sanctioned for their speech.
Got it. Yeah, I was just thinking in the public context, like you noted, there's still quite a lot of censorship that can happen by the state. That's probably because the Pickering common test is really hard to apply and courts are super inconsistent in what they perceive to be a legitimate like interest, right? So it's really hard to predict how courts would do that. Maybe there's a better way to do it for private employers, and maybe then the state would be like, oh, we should adopt that rule as well in the public sphere. But I think given how bad the public test is right now, just because it doesn't work in the public sphere, maybe that's an opportunity then to come up with something better for the private sphere.
Yeah, so again, great question. I mean, two things worth noting. I mean, one is that it's even worse than Pickering, at least on Helen Norton's telling. Pickering is largely superseded by Garcetti, and Garcetti is just like really bad for employee speech in the public context. And so, yeah, you're totally right that we could come up with a law for governing private employment relations and protecting employee speech that just gets things right and is easy to apply and delivers real de facto on the ground protection for employees. I haven't seen it work very well. And I worry that the kind of law that would be really strongly protective of employee speech would approach something like the case law pertaining to academic tenure, and that would really hamper firms' ability to hire and distance themselves from employees effectively. It's a well-known problem, one that we all absorb happily, would enjoy or might enjoy tenure. That like it enables people to basically stop doing their jobs if they so choose without any fear of losing them. That would be a disaster as a general employment kind of institution. It would protect speech really well. And then the question is, can you have something that falls short of something like academic tenure that wouldn't let you just like quiet quit your job and continue to take paychecks? And would be compatible with like economic efficiency. And I'm a little skeptical, but it's not enough for argument. So we fight about the statutes once they're regulated.
Great. Any other questions? Well, thanks for coming, and let's thank Dr. Messina. We'll get just 3 announcements quick too, though. The Philosophers Cafe for tonight was canceled. Unfortunately, Richard E. can't make it. There's an event Friday, does Active Teen violate academic freedom, which will be in the ballrooms, I believe. So Active Teen is the policy that came down from the state legislature, sort of mandating what the gen ed curriculum is in all the UW systems, open to the public. Then we have an event, March 25th after spring break. Historian John Fee will be here to talk about evangelicals and MAGA. So the title is Roads Not Taken, How Evangelicals Embraced MAGA, 6 p.m. March 25th, Cedar Maple. So thanks so much for coming. Appreciate it. Yeah, bro. Okay.
I'll wait here.
Yeah,
Great.
Yeah.
For the MAGA, is that what you're talking about?
What class is the break?
That one,